For 9 years, I let my husband's family believe I was nobody. Then, on Christmas Eve, they put my 7-year-old daughter out in the snow. What they never knew was whose name signed their paychecks. Before we get back to today's story, I have some exciting news to share. We have officially launched a brand new channel called Tales Beneath Skin. Over there, we are dedicating our platform to bringing you the juiciest, most jaw-dropping Reddit drama stories on the internet. We're diving deep into wild family feuds, shocking relationship betrayals, and epic tales of petty revenge. But we don't just leave you hanging with a cliffhanger. We track down every single update, plot twist, and final resolution so you get the complete, satisfying story from start to finish. Grab your popcorn, because we are serving all the tea with full context, community reactions, and top-tier narration that brings the chaos to life. Make sure to subscribe to Tales Beneath Skin right now so you don't miss out. You'll find the link in the video description, the pinned comment, and the collaboration tag. Thank you for your continued support as we grow this community. Now, back to the story. I had a glass dish of scalloped potatoes balanced on my forearm and a canvas bag of wrapped presents cutting into my other hand when I climbed the icy steps to my mother-in-law's front porch. It was Christmas Eve, and the snow was coming down in those fat, unhurried flakes that make everything look like a greeting card. Emma was beside me in her red coat, her cheeks pink, holding the little tin of gingerbread men she had decorated herself that afternoon. She had insisted on carrying them the whole way from the car so they wouldn't break. "Do you think Grandma Margaret will like them?" she asked me, and there was so much hope in her small voice that it made my chest ache. "She's going to love them," I said, because that is what you say to a 7-year-old on Christmas Eve, even when a 9-year knot of experience is tightening in your stomach. I want to be honest with you about who I was in that moment, because it matters for everything that comes after. To Margaret Whitfield and the rest of Paul's family, I was Mila, Paul's second wife, the quiet one, the woman who worked some office job in shipping, who wore the same navy coat 2 winters running and drove a 6-year-old sedan and never had much to say at dinner. I was pleasant and forgettable, and in their private accounting of the world, a little beneath them. Margaret had made that clear in 100 small ways over the years, the kind of ways that never quite rise to the level of something you can name out loud. What none of them knew, what I had spent 9 years making sure they never knew, was that I was the founder and sole owner of Meridian Logistics and Cold Storage, a freight and warehousing company that an appraiser had valued, 3 weeks earlier, at $16.9 million. I built it from a single leased dock and 1 refrigerated trailer when I was 26, sleeping in the office on a cot for the better part of 2 years. I kept the company under my maiden name, Scott, on every filing. I kept my life small and plain on purpose, because I had learned young that when people find out you have money, they stop seeing you and start seeing what they can get. There was another thing they didn't know, and this is the part that still makes my hands go cold when I think about it. Gerald Whitfield, my father-in-law, was a warehouse operations manager at the Meridian facility on Route 9. Brett Whitfield, Paul's younger brother, was a dispatch supervisor at the same site. For 6 years, the checks that paid their mortgages, their car loans, Margaret's country club dues, all of it had come out of a company I owned. They had no idea. To them, they worked for corporate, an abstraction, a logo on a lanyard. They had never once connected the quiet woman married to Paul with the name on the incorporation documents they'd never bothered to read. I reached into my coat pocket, the way I always do without thinking, and closed my fingers around the brass warehouse key on my ring. It's the master key to the Route 9 facility, worn smooth and warm from 18 years of me turning it over between my fingers when I'm nervous. I've had it since the first building was mine. It's the one thing I never leave home without. Margaret opened the door before I could knock. She looked at the dish in my arms, then at Emma, then past both of us as if checking whether anyone more interesting was coming up the walk. "Oh," she said, "you brought potatoes. I already have potatoes." "These are Emma's favorite," I said, smiling, stepping in from the cold. She helped make them. Inside, the house was warm and loud and gold with lamplight. Paul was already there. he'd driven separately, straight from a work thing, and he crossed the room to kiss my cheek and take the dish. Gerald was in his recliner. Brett was on the couch with his phone. Brett's girlfriend, a woman named Ashley, was arranging a charcuterie board with the seriousness of a surgeon. There were cousins, an aunt, a neighbor, Christmas music, the tree. For about 40 minutes, it was almost normal. And then Emma, doing what 7-year-olds do, got excited and ran across the living room and bumped into the side table, and Margaret's crystal angel, the one she reminds everyone was her mother's, teetered and fell and cracked cleanly in two on the hardwood. The room went silent. Emma froze, her lip already trembling. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm sorry, it was an accident." I moved toward my daughter, but Margaret got there first. I have replayed the next 90 seconds more times than I can count. Margaret grabbed Emma by the upper arm, hard, and marched her, not to a chair, not to a corner, but to the front door. She opened it, and the cold came rushing in, and she put my crying 7-year-old daughter out onto the snowy porch in her socks, no coat, and pulled the door shut. "She can learn some manners out there," Margaret said, brushing her hands together. "Clumsy little thing." That's what happens when a child isn't raised right. I heard Emma's small fists hit the door. I heard her calling for me through the wood. And I looked around that warm, gold room at all of them, at Brett, who snorted and went back to his phone, at Ashley, who looked away, at Gerald, who studied his drink, at Paul, who stood there frozen with his mouth half open, saying nothing, doing nothing, and something in me that had been quiet and folded and patient for 9 long years stood up, brushed itself off, and decided it was finished being small. They had spent nearly a decade underestimating the woman with the plain coat and the quiet voice. They were about to find out exactly what she was made of. I did not scream. That's the thing people always expect, and it's the thing I did not do. I walked to that door, and I opened it, and I picked my daughter up off the freezing boards of that porch. Her socks were soaked through. She was shaking, more from fear than cold, her face buried instantly in my neck, and I could feel her heart going like a bird's against my chest. I carried her back inside, and I held her, and I looked at Margaret over the top of my little girl's head. "Get her out of the doorway," Margaret said. "You're letting the heat out." "She's 7, I said. My voice came out very level. That's what I remember most, how level it was, when everything underneath it was on fire. You put a 7-year-old child outside in the snow, in December, over a broken figurine. It was my mother's. It was glass. Well, Margaret lifted her chin. Maybe if you spent less time at that little job of yours, and more time teaching her how to behave in a real home, we wouldn't be having this conversation. I looked at Paul then. I gave him 1 full second, one to be my husband, to be Emma's father, to say a single word. He looked at the floor. That silence told me more than any speech could have. I understood, standing there with my daughter's cold socks in my hand, that I had been managing this family's opinion of me for 9 years, shrinking myself, keeping the peace, telling myself it was maturity when really it was fear, and that all that shrinking had bought me exactly nothing. The moment it counted, not one of them had chosen me or my child. I put Emma's shoes back on her feet. I wrapped her in her red coat. I gathered the tin of gingerbread men she'd made, still untouched on the counter where no one had even opened it, and I put it back in my bag. "We're going home," I said. "Oh, don't be dramatic," Brett said from the couch, not even looking up. "It's Christmas." "You're right," I said, "it is." Paul followed us out to the car, finally finding his voice now that his mother couldn't hear it. Mila, come on, you know how she is. She didn't mean anything by it, she's just old-fashioned." I buckled Emma into her seat. I kissed her forehead. Then I straightened up and looked at my husband across the roof of the car, the snow settling on both of us. "She put our daughter outside in the snow, Paul, and you watched." I froze, okay. I didn't know what to. "You knew what to do, you just didn't do it. I opened my door. Drive safe, I'll see you at home." That night, after Emma was finally asleep, after 2 mugs of cocoa and a bath and me lying beside her until her breathing went slow, and even I sat alone at my kitchen table in the dark. And I did the thing I do when I need to think clearly, the thing I've done my whole life. I took the brass key off my ring and set it on the table in front of me, and I turned it slowly under the little light over the stove, the way I used to turn it in that cold first warehouse when I was 26 and terrified, and the only person who believed the company would survive was me. That key has been in my pocket through every hard thing I've ever done. It was there the day I made my first hire, and the day I nearly lost everything in the 9 crash, and the day I signed for the Route 9 facility, the exact building where, 6 years later, Gerald Whitfield would clock in every morning to a paycheck he had no idea I signed. I turned it over and over. And somewhere around midnight, sitting in the dark with that little brass key warming in my hand, I stopped grieving what had happened on that porch and started to think. Not about revenge, exactly. I want to be careful how I say this. I thought about consequences. About the strange, quiet fact that the people who had just told me I worked a little job, who had thrown my daughter into the snow and called her clumsy and badly raised, every one of them who worked for me. And not one of them knew it. I closed my hand around the key. To understand how much that porch cost me, you have to understand how much I had already given. I met Paul 9 years ago, when Emma was a baby and I was a single mother running a company I still told no one about. He was kind then, genuinely kind, the kind of man who noticed when you were tired and made you tea without being asked. I loved that about him. I still don't think it was fake. I think Paul is simply a man who never learned how to stand up to his family, and so he learned instead how to disappear whenever standing up was required. I kept my company secret from him for the first year we dated, and when I finally told him, I made him promise to keep it from his parents. He didn't understand why at first. They'd be thrilled, he said. My mom would love it. No, I told him. Your mom would love it, that's the problem. I had watched how Margaret treated Paul's first wife, who came from money, the constant angling, the loans that were never repaid, the way affection came with a price tag. I didn't want that. I wanted to be loved as Mila, the plain woman in the navy coat, and if they couldn't manage that, I wanted to know. So for 9 years I performed smallness. I let Margaret condescend to me at holidays. I let her correct the way I raised Emma. I bit my tongue when she called my work a little job, a job that, in truth, employed over 200 people and moved 40% of the region's cold freight. I paid for things quietly, anonymously, the down payment on Paul's brother's first car, funneled through a bonus at work that Brett bragged about for a year, never knowing where it came from. I gave and gave and gave from behind a curtain, and I let them think I had nothing to give. Margaret was the architect of all of it. She was not a loud villain. That's what made her effective. She wore pearls and hosted lovely dinners and had a way of delivering the cruelest things in the sweetest voice, so that if you objected, you were the one making a scene. Over the years, she had quietly worked to keep me at the edge of the family, seating me at the far end of the table, forgetting to invite Emma to the cousins' outings, telling Paul in front of me that he'd settled, but that she supposed love was love. And then there was the money question. It had been getting worse for about a year, and it always came through Brett and Margaret together, the two of them working the same angle from different sides. Brett had started needing things, a bigger house, a boat, an investment opportunity. And Margaret had started asking Paul, in that airy way of hers, whether Mila's family had anything put away, whether Paul would ever come into anything, whether there was money somewhere in the picture. At Thanksgiving, she had cornered me by the sink and asked, out of absolutely nowhere, whether my parents had left me anything when they passed. Just some old furniture, I'd told her. She'd said, disappointed, and drifted away. That was the tell I had circled in my mind for months without wanting to name it. They weren't interested in me at all. They were interested in whether I was hiding anything worth taking. Margaret sniffing at inheritances. Brett's escalating needs. The way the warmth switched on the moment they thought money might be near, and off the moment they decided it wasn't. They had been probing the walls of my life for a year, looking for the vault. They never once imagined they were already standing inside it. I did not sleep that night. But by the time the sun came up over the snow-covered yard on Christmas morning, I was no longer the woman who had stood frozen in that doorway. Somewhere in those dark hours at the kitchen table, with the brass key going warm in my palm, I had stopped being the person things happened to and become the person who decided what happened next. I want to be clear about something, because I've turned it over in my mind 100 times since. I did not sit down that night and plot to ruin anyone. What I sat down and did was much simpler, and I think, much harder to argue with. I decided to stop protecting people who had never once protected my child. For 9 years, I had spent an enormous amount of energy managing this family's comfort, hiding who I was so they'd never have to feel small, softening every edge, giving in secret so no one would ever feel indebted. I had been carrying all of them quietly the whole time, and I simply decided to set the weight down and let them feel their own actual footing for once. The leverage was not something I had to go find. That's the strange, quiet power of it. I already owned it. I owned the building Gerald reported to. I owned the payroll Brett drew from. I owned the company that had, without any of them knowing, been the invisible floor beneath their whole comfortable lives for 6 years. I hadn't planned it that way. Gerald had been hired long before I met Paul, and I'd only realized the connection a year into my marriage, and by then it had felt easier to say nothing than to unravel it. I'd kept it as a secret inside a secret, but a secret is just an unused key. Christmas Eve was the day I decided to use it. At 6 in the morning, I made coffee and opened my laptop at the kitchen table. I logged into the Meridian Operations portal, the real one, the owner's dashboard that only 3 people in the world have credentials for. And I did the first thing I had never once let myself do in 6 years. I pulled the personnel files on Gerald Whitfield and Brett Whitfield. I told myself I was only confirming what I knew. But I'm a careful person. I built a company from a cot in a warehouse by being careful, so I read everything. Gerald's file was ordinary, decent reviews, a warehouse lifer, nothing unusual. It made me a little sad, honestly. He'd sat in that recliner and studied his drink while his granddaughter cried on the porch, but his file was just a man who'd shown up to work for years. I made a note and moved on. Brett's file was where the floor tilted. Brett had been promoted to dispatch supervisor 2 years earlier, which gave him authority over carrier assignments and, critically, over the small vendor accounts. The local contractor's Meridian pays to handle overflow hauling. And there, buried in 8 months of routing records, was a pattern I recognized immediately, because catching exactly this kind of thing is a thing I've had to do before. Brett had been steering a disproportionate volume of overflow loads to a single carrier, an LLC called Northline Freight Partners, at rates well above what our other overflow vendors charged. Northline had been incorporated 14 months ago. It had one listed officer, Ashley, Brett's girlfriend. The one who'd arranged the charcuterie board and looked away while my daughter cried in the snow. I sat back from the laptop. Outside, the snow was blue in the early light. Down the hall, Emma was still asleep, safe, warm, and I made myself sit with what I was looking at before I did anything at all. Brett wasn't just an entitled man who needed a boat. Brett was quietly skimming from my company, routing my freight to his girlfriend's shell company at inflated rates and pocketing the spread. That was the investment opportunity he'd bragged about. That was the bigger house. Every dollar of it had come out of Meridian, out of me. I called one person that morning. Her name is Renata, and she has been my operations controller and my closest professional confidant for 11 years. She is the only person besides my accountant who knows the whole shape of my life. She answered on the second ring, and I could hear her kids in the background. "Merry Christmas," she said warily, because I never call on Christmas. "Renata," I said, "I need you to quietly pull every routing record and payment against Northline Freight Partners for the last 14 months, and I need you to not tell anyone you're doing it. Not yet." There was a pause. "Mila, what happened?" I looked down at the brass key sitting on the table beside my coffee. I picked it up and closed my hand around it. "They put Emma in the snow," I said, "and I found out who's been standing in my house the whole time." Paul came home Christmas morning around 9, snow on his shoulders, holding a grocery store poinsettia like a peace offering he already knew wouldn't be enough. He found me at the kitchen table, dressed, composed, the laptop closed, my coffee cold. Emma was in the living room in her pajamas, watching cartoons, blessedly unaware. I had needed her to be somewhere she felt safe before I said any of what I was about to say. Mila. He set the poinsettia on the counter. About last night, I talked to my mom this morning. She feels terrible. Does she? Well, she said Emma needs to be more careful, but she knows she overreacted, and she said if you come back for Christmas dinner tonight, she'll. Paul, I said his name gently, and it stopped him because I never fight, and he could feel that something was different. Sit down. He sat. I need to tell you some things, I said, and I need you to just listen because I've kept quiet for 9 years and I'm done being quiet. I folded my hands on the table. Do you know who Gerald works for? Your father. Do you know the name of the company? He blinked. Some corporate thing, Meridian, I think. Why? I own it, I said. The clock on the wall ticked twice. You what? Meridian Logistics and Cold Storage. I founded it 18 years ago before I met you. It's under my maiden name, Scott, on every document, which is why you never connected it. Your father has worked in my building on Route 9 for 6 years. Your brother works there too. I have signed every paycheck they've ever cashed. I paid for Brett's first car, that work bonus he bragged about for a year. That was me. All of it was me. I've been carrying this entire family, quietly, since the day I married you. And I never said a word because I wanted your mother to love me for nothing, for being Mila in a navy coat. I wanted to be sure it was real. Paul's mouth had come open. He looked for a moment exactly the way he'd looked in that doorway, frozen, out of his depth. That's Mila, that's not possible. You drive a... I drive a normal car because I like a normal life. The company was appraised 3 weeks ago at $16.9 million. I watched that land. I'm not telling you this to impress you. I'm telling you because your mother spent last night sneering at my little job minutes after she put our daughter, outside in the snow. And I need you to understand exactly who was standing in her living room while she did it. He put both hands over his face. When he took them away, he looked 10 years older. Why didn't you ever tell me? Because I was afraid of exactly what your mother is, I said, and it turns out I was right to be. Then I opened the laptop and turned it toward him, and I showed him the second thing, the Northline records, the routing pattern, the inflated rates, Ashley's name on the incorporation as the sole officer. Your brother has been stealing from my company for over a year, I said quietly, routing my freight to his girlfriend's shell company and pocketing the difference. The investment he keeps bragging about. That's it. That's fraud, Paul, against me, while calling my job little. Paul stared at the screen, and here is the thing I had not fully let myself expect. He didn't defend them. Something in his face broke and reassembled. Ashley's company, he said slowly. Brett said he got in early on a logistics startup. He's been telling everyone he found this genius investment. My mom's been telling her whole church group her son's a businessman now. I know, I said. He found it, inside my company. Paul called Brett right there at the table on speaker. Before I could stop him, I think he needed to hear it himself. And Brett, who had no idea what his brother knew, did exactly what guilty people do when they feel the floor move under them. He lashed out. Why are you asking me about Northline? Brett's voice came sharp and defensive through the phone. Who told you that name? Is this Mila? Is your wife going through my business now? God, Paul, she's been weird about money this whole family for years. Maybe if she made real money instead of pushing paper in a warehouse, she wouldn't have to snoop into mine. Paul looked up at me across the table. Brett, he said very quietly, the warehouse you work in, she owns it. There was a long, long silence on the line, and then Brett laughed, high and thin and frightened, and said, "That's not funny," and hung up. The calls started within 20 minutes. Brett first, 3 times, which I let ring, then Margaret, then Gerald. Then Margaret again, and this time Paul answered because I asked him to, and I sat beside him and listened to his mother's voice come through the phone, that same airy, sweet, poisonous voice, trying to find out how much was true and how much she could still manage. Paul, sweetheart, Brett called me very upset, saying Mila is spreading some story about owning her company. Now, we all know that's, well, it's a bit much, isn't it? A woman in a warehouse job. I think your wife has gotten herself very worked up over a broken figurine, and she's saying things she can't possibly. It's true, Mom, Paul said. And honestly, if she's going to make wild claims and threaten your brother, then maybe she isn't the kind of stable person we want around the family. Have you considered that? For Emma's sake, I've said from the beginning she was. Mom, stop. I had never heard Paul's voice do that before. It's true, every word, I've seen the documents. Mila owns Meridian. She owns the building Dad works in. She owns the company Brett's been stealing from. Do you understand what I'm telling you? Brett committed fraud against my wife's company, and last night you put her daughter in the snow. The silence from Margaret was the most honest sound I'd heard from her in 9 years. And then, I will remember this as long as I live, she recalculated in real time. I heard it happen. The sneer drained out of her voice and something warm and frightened rushed in to fill it. Well, she said, well, why didn't she ever say anything? Paul, this is wonderful news. We're family, we can all sit down. I'm sure Brett didn't understand the situation. We can work all of this out. Tell Mila to come to dinner and we'll. Goodbye, Mom, Paul said and hung up. He put the phone down and looked at it for a long moment. She switched, he said, almost to himself. The second she knew, she just switched. Yes, I said gently. That's what I've been trying not to say to you for 9 years. While the phone rang and rang that morning, Renata sent me the full file. And it was worse than I'd thought, because it always is, once you actually look. Northline hadn't started 14 months ago as a first offense. Renata had cross-referenced and found that the pattern went back further, that Brett had also been approving expedite fees and detention charges that quietly routed back through the same account. The total, over 18 months, came to just over $340,000. Skimmed, dollar by dollar, from the company owned by the sister-in-law he called a paper pusher. There was one more confrontation before Christmas Day was over, and it was the one that finally broke the last of it for Paul. Brett showed up at our door at 4 in the afternoon, unannounced, with Ashley in the car. He'd swung all the way from denial to panic. He stood on my porch, the same kind of porch his mother had put my daughter out on the night before, and he begged, Mila, come on. It's okay, it got out of hand, but it's family money, right? It's basically in the family. I'll pay it back, I swear, please don't do anything official, my mom will die, Ashley will, he was crying. You wouldn't do that to family, would you? I stood in my doorway, warm light behind me, and I thought about Emma's socks soaked through with snow. Family, I repeated quietly. You threw my daughter into the cold and laughed at your phone. You've been stealing from me for a year and a half while calling my job little. You never once treated me like family, Brett. Not one single day. I reached into my pocket and closed my hand around the brass key, and I felt steadier than I had in years. You don't get to become family now, that it's expensive not to be. I closed the door gently. I did not slam it. And through the wood, I heard him start to shout, and then I heard Ashley's car door, and then I heard them drive away. Behind me, Paul was standing in the hall, and Emma had come out of the living room and wrapped her arms around my leg, and for the first time in 9 years, my husband put his arm around both of us at the same time and didn't let go. I have watched enough television to know how people expect a story like this to end. They expect me to walk into Margaret's Christmas dinner in a fur coat, throw a stack of documents on the table, and deliver a speech while the whole family gasps. That is not what I did. What I did was quieter, and I think, in the end, far more complete. Because I have learned that the people who really hold power almost never raise their voices. They simply sign things. On the morning of December 26th, I drove to the Route 9 facility. Not to my little kept quiet corner of the world, to my building, the one I'd signed for 18 years earlier, the one where my father-in-law had clocked in for 6 years without ever knowing whose name was on the deed. I let myself in the side door with the brass key. I want to tell you how that felt. Turning that worn key in the lock of my own building, on my own terms, for the first time in this whole story, as exactly who I am. I stood in the cold quiet of the loading floor for a moment, and I let myself simply be Mila Scott, who built all of this from a cot and a single refrigerated trailer, and who was not small and had never been small. Renata met me in the office. She had prepared everything I'd asked for, laid out on the conference table in neat folders, the way we've handled every serious thing for 11 years. I did 3 things that morning, calmly, in order. First, I authorized the fraud file, the complete Northline record, all $341,000 of it, to be forwarded to our corporate counsel and to our external forensic auditor, with instructions to pursue full recovery and to report the findings to the authorities as the law required. Not out of rage. Because it was theft, and I own a company, and you cannot let theft stand simply because the thief married into your family. I signed the authorization with a steady hand. Second, I terminated Brett Whitfield for cause, effective immediately, documented cleanly through HR and legal, the theft, the self-dealing, the shell company. There was no drama in it. It was a signature and a date. Ashley's Northline Freight Partners was removed from our approved carrier list the same hour, its contracts void. Third, and this is the one I thought hardest about, I looked at Gerald's file again. Gerald had done nothing criminal. He had only sat in a recliner while his granddaughter cried in the snow, which is not a firing offense, however much it deserved to be. But I also knew Gerald's position had been quietly propped up for years by favorable scheduling and overtime that Brett, as supervisor, had funneled to his own father. With Brett gone and the department restructured under proper controls, Gerald's inflated hours simply evaporated. His role was consolidated in the reorganization, a legitimate business decision that any owner would make, and one I made without malice and without exception. He was offered the same severance package as anyone else in his band. No more, no less. The comfortable life the Whitfields had built on top of my company without ever knowing it was mine was gone by lunchtime, not because I burned it down, but because I simply stopped holding it up. Then I went home. The final moment, the one that felt like the real climax to me, happened not at Meridian and not at Margaret's, but at my own kitchen table that evening, and it belonged to Paul. His mother had been calling all day. So had Gerald. So had Brett. The messages had gone from furious to pleading to furious again. Margaret had left a voicemail I made Paul play for me because I wanted him to hear it beside me. In it, she said that Paul was betraying his own blood, that a real son would make his wife see reason, that Mila was tearing the family apart out of spite over a broken figurine. Paul listened to the whole thing. Then he picked up the phone and called her back, and he put it on speaker, and he did the thing he had been unable to do in that doorway on Christmas Eve. "Mom," he said, and his voice didn't shake this time. "You want to talk about blood. Emma is my daughter. Maybe not by blood, but she is mine, and you put her outside in the snow, and you called her badly raised, and you did it in front of me, and I said nothing, and I will be ashamed of that for the rest of my life. Mila didn't tear this family apart. Brett stole. You were cruel. I stayed quiet. That's what tore it apart, and I'm not going to be quiet anymore." He paused. "When you're ready to apologize to my wife and my daughter, really apologize. Not because you found out she has money, you can call. Until then, don't." He hung up, his hand was shaking, but he'd done it. And Emma, who had wandered in for a glass of water in her pajamas, looked up at both of us and asked, "Are we still going to make cookies?" "Yes, baby," I said, and my voice finally broke just a little. "We're going to make all the cookies." It has been just over a year now, and I can tell you how it all settled, because people always want to know. Brett's fraud case did not go the way he'd gambled it would. He had bet everything on the belief that I would never take family to court, that the shame would protect him. It didn't. The forensic audit was thorough, and the paper trail was undeniable. He entered into a settlement to avoid trial, agreeing to full restitution of the $341,000, which he had spent and could not produce, which meant the house he'd bragged about, and the boat and Ashley's car were all liquidated to cover it. He pleaded to a reduced charge and received probation and a permanent mark on his record that follows him into every job application in an industry where nobody hires a dispatch supervisor who stole from his own employer. Ashley left him within 2 months. Northline dissolved. The last I heard, Brett was living in a rented room and working nights at a warehouse 2 counties over, not mine. Gerald took his severance and his consolidated position with a bitterness that eventually, I'm told, curdled into something quieter. He never apologized. Neither did Margaret, not really. She sent a card, months later, that was less an apology than a negotiation, full of phrases like, "if we all made mistakes," and "for the sake of the family," and I read it once and put it in a drawer. Margaret's real punishment was not anything I did. It was that the story got out, small towns being what they are, and the church group version of Margaret, the one whose son was a businessman and whose daughter-in-law was beneath her, simply stopped being available to her. She had spent years telling everyone how she'd married her son down. Now everyone knew that the woman she'd sneered at had been quietly employing her husband and her son the whole time, and had put a 7-year-old in the snow anyway. There is no country club membership that survives that story. She lost the only thing she had ever really valued, which was the way she looked to other people, and she lost it entirely by her own hand. I never had to lift a finger. That is the part I've made my peace with. I didn't destroy the Whitfields. I just stopped protecting them from the consequences of who they'd always been. Paul and I are still together, and I won't pretend that part was simple or instant. There was a lot to work through, 9 years of my hiding, his 9 years of silence. We went to counseling. We had hard, honest conversations at that same kitchen table, some of them until 2 in the morning. But the man who stood up to his mother on speakerphone kept standing up, week after week, in 100 smaller ways, and slowly I came to trust that the person I'd married had finally found his spine. It wasn't a sweeping, tearful reunion. It was quieter than that and steadier, and I think that's why it lasted. Emma is 8 now. She doesn't ask about Grandma Margaret much anymore, and when she does, we tell her the truth in the simplest way we can, that some people didn't treat her kindly, and that it's okay to keep people who aren't kind at a distance. She made gingerbread men again this past Christmas. This time, they got eaten, every single one, at our own table, with the people who actually love her. As for me, I stopped hiding. Not loudly, I still drive my normal car and wear my navy coat because I genuinely like a quiet life. But I don't shrink anymore. I don't perform smallness for anyone. Meridian is thriving. We crossed 250 employees this year, all of them people I'm proud to sign for. I still carry the brass key. It's still worn smooth, still warm from my pocket. Some nights, when the house is quiet and Emma's asleep and Paul's beside me on the couch, I take it out and turn it over in my fingers the way I always have. But it doesn't feel like a secret anymore. It just feels like mine. It always was. They spent 9 years thinking I was nobody. It turned out I was the floor they were all standing on. And the day they threw my daughter into the snow was the day I finally decided to let them find that out.